This podcast is sponsored by Great Seminars and Books. Have you ever thought about how we can become leaders in geriatric care, or how we can break out of the silos of rehab to serve older adults to the best of our ability? Well, myself and Dr. Carole Lewis of Great Seminars and Books will be holding a free webinar titled Breaking Out of the Clinic: Strategies to Become Leaders in Geriatric Care. This webinar will take place on October 9th, 2017 at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To get access to this webinar, just go to seniorrehabproject.com/great. Hit me.
This is a Senior Rehab podcast, the podcast for rehab clinicians that want to better serve older adults.
Welcome to the Senior Rehab Podcast. Thank you for the download. Today's guest is the one and only Greg Hartley. Dr. Hartley is a doctor of PT and assistant professor of clinical physical therapy at the U, aka the University of Miami in Florida. He's a board-certified geriatric clinical specialist, that's GCS, and a certified exercise expert for the aging adult, that is CEEAA. He's also the founding program director of the first APTA accredited geriatric residency in the United States. He served as director and secretary on the board of directors of the Academy of Geriatric PT and was the chair of the Academy of Geriatric PT's practice committee from 2007 to 2017. He is currently the director of practice for the Florida PT Association. He has worked in home health, outpatient, subacute rehab, long-term care, acute care, and rehabilitation hospital settings. Greg, do you ever get bored?
No, it doesn't sound like it, does it?
It's impressive. It's impressive. Well, thank you for coming on the show. I've heard a lot of good things about you, and a lot of the people in the Senior Rehab Project Facebook group are friends of yours and have had awesome things to say. So I'm excited to get to chat with you.
Well, great, and thanks for having me. I've been looking forward to this.
All right, so let's dive into this. Have you always been interested in geriatrics?
Since I started my college education, I was, and it was probably not an atypical story where I had a family member. Actually, my grandmother was involved in a serious accident and needed physical therapy for many years after that. And that was my first exposure to physical therapy, and I just fell in love with the profession, watching her be rehabilitated for many months and what turned out to be a very long recovery. And I didn't know anything about physical therapy until then, but that exposure really sort of changed the whole trajectory of my my college education, where I began to pursue PT. And so that's what I did. When I graduated physical therapy school, it was many years ago. So
you can date yourself. That's perfectly fine with me.
So it was back in 1988, I guess, I started PT school. Mm-hmm. And that was back in the day when the VA was actually giving some scholarships for PT school and paid full tuition and living expenses and the whole deal. So I had applied for one of those and gotten it. And so once I graduated physical therapy school, I had to work at a VA in return. And it was a pretty sweet deal because it was a one-to-one payback. So for every year they funded, I owed them a year of employment. So I really only ended up owing them about 2 years of employment. This was back when it was an entry-level master's program at that time. So I ended up working at the VA in Miami and then another VA in Birmingham, Alabama, and ended up staying there for 6 years. Really liked it, particularly the one in Birmingham. I had an opportunity to sort of move up the totem pole in that particular facility. And worked mostly with aging veterans. At the time, this predated any conflicts in the Middle East. So most of the veterans were Vietnam, Korean, and World War II vets. So most of them were aging adults. So that was pretty much the population that I treated when I was there for those 6 years. I worked mostly in acute and outpatient settings in those two VAs. And I then realized or thought that I wanted to become board certified in geriatrics. It was something that I had heard about. It was still, I won't say new, because I think cardiopulmonary had been doing it since the 70s, but it was new to me. And I knew that I wanted to become board certified. And of course, at the time, there were no residencies. And one of the suggestions for becoming board certified and studying and passing that board exam was to get experiences in as many different settings as you could, particularly those settings that were, fairly typical for aging adult populations, like home health, rehab hospitals, and the settings that I had obviously already been in. So I decided to make a move, and I ended up going into home health and working for an organization doing home health. Did that for about 6 years. After
was that
in
Alabama?
Yeah, that was up in Alabama. Also kind of moved up in that organization into more and more administrative roles as well. And then a sort of twist of fate happened, and I decided I wanted to move back to Miami. And so I did that. And here in Miami, I started working for a really large post-acute care provider in the area. They are an organization that is only in Southeast Florida, but a large post-acute care organization with inpatient rehab and skilled nursing and home health and long-term care, assisted living, the whole spectrum of care. So I started working there, and shortly after I began working there, I decided, I said, this thing called residencies is out there now, and I think this would be a really cool place to have a residency, because we had that whole spectrum in that particular setting. And so I approached my boss and my boss's bosses and asked them if they had any interest. And I was super lucky that one of the chief operating officer of that company actually was a former board of director on the APTA board of directors. And so he knew about residencies, having been a board member when that whole notion was approved, and supported it wholeheartedly. So got that residency up and going, and then stayed there for, I guess about 12 years. And then just entered academia full time only about 2 years ago. Yeah. So that's kind of my journey.
We can go several directions from this. I know we're going to dive into a lot of those experiences, especially with residency and how you perceive geriatric education. But I want to go way back to when you were going into PT school. I'm just envisioning you're a male in PT school, which you're already, the minority, more than likely. But then you are a male that also wants to work with older adults. Were you the black sheep of PT school?
Yeah, probably. Having said that, though, there were a lot of people in my class that have moved on to do fairly, I think, surprising things and really interesting, cool things. And there was something sort of special about my class. I'm not sure why, but so many of us ended up in academia and teaching and just really doing some fairly cool stuff. Yeah. But to my recollection, I might have been the only one that was sort of overtly interested in geriatrics. Knowing, though, that I needed to go work at the VA after I graduated from PT school, that was not something that, maybe everybody didn't know that because they just knew I was going to go work at the VA. But life sort of took me down that path for sure.
Yeah. So, just remembering what it was like to be, in PT school with those interests of yours and knowing what the majority of your classmates were interested in or what they were pursuing. Is that very different from what you've experienced today, at the school that you're teaching right now?
I don't know that it is different now. And I believe that one reason that it's different is because we do have recognized specialty areas in physical therapy, which we did have before. Mostly they were represented as sections at the time. And then ultimately they became recognized as areas of board certification through the American Board of Physical Therapy Specialties. And geriatrics was one of the first of those. But now residency education and becoming board certified in a specialty area has become so popular that I think students who overtly say, I'm interested in geriatrics, are a little bit more common. I don't think that they would be considered the black sheep, although I will say that they are absolutely 100% still in the minority. Very, very few students come in and just will say, I'm interested in geriatrics. There's always one or two, thankfully, but it certainly isn't like sports or ortho, which tend to be the areas that almost all the students come in thinking that's what they want to do, and a handful of pediatrics always too. So geriatrics is always a small minority in classes even today.
So let's go, to your experience, starting the first geriatric residency. So you were there, you said 12 years?
Yeah, I was. Right. I directed that program for about 12 years. Right up until I left that position and moved into academia in 2015. So from around 2003, I started the program. It became accredited in 2004. And then I was there all the way until 2015.
Okay. So in that, that time period with all the people that you've spent so much time with, just teaching them, working with them, helping, develop them as people and clinicians. What were some of the biggest changes that you saw in the people that went through that program? How did it change them for the better?
Well, I believe, residency education is essential in, I think, clinical development, and post-professional education is a piece of the puzzle for physical therapists that is currently voluntary. So people volunteer to do this. So the people that do residencies now are generally high achievers. They are go-getters. They are driven and also have very clear professional and personal goals. And so I find that most of the people who do residencies succeed and do very well because that's the kind of person that's attracted to a residency to begin with. I also see, though, that they really mature through the process, and it really is sort of a fine-tuning of clinical decision-making so that they move further and further towards the master clinician through the course of the year, really sort of fine-tuning that clinical decision-making skill. There's a lot of early on novice kind of behavior that you see with any clinician right out of school. And I think that this will tie into the a best practice in clinical education report that I was lucky enough to be on this task force. And one of the things that came out of the task force relative to that and pertains to residency education as well, which is why I bring it up, is we have this belief that we graduate physical therapists from entry-level programs who are generalists, who are essentially able to take care of every patient condition across the entire lifespan from birth to death, and in every component of acuity or chronicity, whatever it might be. And that is what we have, I think, traditionally believed. And if you were to ask most people what product is produced at the end of a physical therapy education, most people answer that they're a generalist, that's what we produce. And the task force thought about that long and hard and sort of came to the realization that that's not really at all what we produce. What we produce are basicist, people that are competent in taking care of fairly non-complex cases, can determine when patients need our services and when they don't, and when they should refer out. But they are not yet at sort of the level of clinician where they could be able to manage every patient with every condition across the lifespan. And I think when you see a person join a residency or begin a residency, they come in as that basicist, and to be able to see them mature to the level of a competent, not only just the competent clinician, but by the end of the residency, the competent geriatric clinician, so that they are now a specialist and they're functioning as a specialist using high-level evidence, making clear clinical decisions, being efficient in their care, and obviously being patient-centered. That's, for me, always just the beauty of being able to teach and see people grow over that time to become that expert clinician. They may not be expert at the end of the year, but they're definitely going to be specialists at the end of the year. And they're certainly on I think, a fast track to expertise or master clinician. And I think that really is kind of the future for our profession. I don't know that every physical therapist coming out of school can be a generalist or a physical therapist that can manage every problem across the lifespan for every patient. And I think even now, you could argue that physical therapists already specialize in something. And regardless of whether or not they become board certified in the area, they will specialize by virtue of where they choose to work. And so if you work in a school system, then you're working with pediatrics. If you work in a SNF, then you're likely working with aging adults. If you work in an outpatient center, then you're likely working with orthopedic, potentially neuro, but also orthopedic type cases. And even within large outpatient practices, you find that people even get highly specialized in those environments where, for example, if somebody walks in with lymphedema, they're going to go see, Janie, and because Janie's got the experience and the training in lymphedema. If somebody walks in and has a pelvic health issue, they're going to go see, Jimmy, because he's got the experience with that. So even within large outpatient practices, people tend to specialize and even subspecialize based on where they work. And so it's a unique situation in physical therapy that we believe that we can manage every patient all the time, regardless of their condition, regardless of their age, regardless of their chronicity. And I think that as our profession has evolved into one where evidence is coming at us at a speed that is impossible to keep up with across the entire human experience, you really have to pick something. You have to pick a specialty. You have to decide where you are going to be an expert or where you're going to be a master clinician, because I don't think you can be the master of all of it.
Yeah, that is a very good point. And that right there, what you just mentioned, has been a struggle for me in actually using the title doctor. For me, I know a lot of people disagree with me, but I've just really struggled to really embrace like calling myself Dr. Dustin Jones. I think there's many factors that go into that, but I think the big one was just being married to a physician and just seeing just the man, how different the education is, and what you're kind of explaining, moving towards is definitely what, a lot of physicians will go through. They'll kind of be the basicist, if you will, but then they have to specialize, just because it's almost impossible to be able to treat all these different types of people well. And I'll never forget, though, whenever I spent most of my time in kind of sports ortho out of PT school, And then I was wanting to take a contract job at a nursing home. And I told my wife, like, yeah, I got fired from this one position. I'm probably going to take this 13-week contract job in a nursing home, mainly working with older adults. And she just looked at me like, what? How are you going to do that? Like, don't you have to take like some board certification course, or like you didn't even do, like any specialty training. She's so used to you have to do a residency, for like 3 to 4 or 5 years to be able to even be in the discussion of working in a certain position.
Right.
And so, it was shocking for her to see how I could literally just pick up and, work with nothing but kids in the school system. And the next day, go to a nursing home. It was beyond her comprehension. And when I thought about that, it's like, wow, man, we do have, we definitely do have some room to improve our skills overall. So how you mentioned that task force that you're a part of, what did you all kind of come up with? What do you think would be a good direction to move for our profession?
Well, as you mentioned, I just completed work on a task force called Best Practice for Physical Therapist Clinical Education. That was a task force appointed by the board, but charged by the House of Delegates to really explore and take a deep dive into clinical training of physical therapists that would encompass both the professional phase or the entry-level phase, as well as post-professional education. Pardon me. And so, and the part of the charge was to obviously explore all of that, but really the charge was to come up with what we believed to be best practices for clinical education and what the direction of physical therapist clinical training should look like in the coming decades. And so we did take a deep dive, and it was a tremendous amount of work, extremely rewarding, probably one of the most rewarding things I've ever done professionally for myself or the association for sure, and for the profession really. But it was a lot of work. We met over about a year and a half, not quite a year and a half, but a little more than a year. And we met every other week and talked to a huge variety of stakeholders. And without belaboring this, because it is a lengthy report and took a tremendous amount of effort and a huge amount of thought went into this. But the idea is what emerged were some underlying sort of themes. And one was that clinical education as it is today is really unsustainable in terms of how we educate our entry-level clinicians. We're already beginning to see clinical sites that are charging to take students. So part of it is economic. Part of it is driven by policy and reimbursement systems that prohibit our students from treating Part B patients in many environments. So part of it is that. Part of it has to do with student debt load. What kind of student are we even attracting to the profession, given the return on investment for physical therapist education? So we really considered big questions and looked at where we thought this ought to go. And after a year and a half of conversation with every person we could think we needed to talk to, the task force sat down and came up with an idea that the professional phase of education or the entry-level phase of education should potentially be a little bit shorter. It might not be much shorter, but it would focus on the didactic content, classwork, and there would be integrated clinical experiences peppered throughout that didactic or professional phase. So it wouldn't be completely didactic. There would always be integrated clinical experiences of various lengths, and we would need to determine the minimum amount of weeks of that and the maximum amount of weeks of that. And actually, the recommendation is that we agree on a number, and everybody does that it's all the same in terms of weeks. And those experiences would need to be varied so that they would include exposure to aging adults, just as they would include exposure to children and everything in between. Once the professional phase of education was complete, the terminal internships that are now part of the professional phase, we proposed that those internships would happen after licensure. And so there would be a licensure exam given at the completion of the didactic or professional phase of education. And that licensure exam would grant a restricted license. So it wouldn't be full licensure. So the therapist would have a staged or stepped license, and they would get privileges to treat, privileges to bill, which is important in the whole economic model of how this works. And then they would do their clinical internships in clinical sites that would be tightly partnered with academic institutions, but would hire the clinical intern as an employee. So they now have some sort of skin in the game. And certainly the clinical intern would not make as much money as a entry-level PT would today, meaning they have unrestricted license. But someone with a restricted license would probably make a little bit less money. But importantly, they wouldn't be paying tuition for this time, and it would be occurring post-professionally. That period of internships would happen over a period of, we didn't agree on a number here, so it could be anywhere from 6 months, maybe up to a year. I think a lot of that would depend on where the internships were, as well as the student's needs. I think some students complete that phase faster than others. And so there was a suggestion, actually a separate recommendation, that there be a standardized clinical curriculum and that there be benchmarks and milestones put in through that clinical internship phase, so that we would be able to gauge the progression of the student through that phase. Certainly, that phase of education would require oversight. So the proposal would be that the oversight of that phase, since it was occurring post-professionally, would become part of what the Board for Physical Therapy Residency and Fellowship Education currently does. So they would take that on as well in terms of oversight of process. Then after that 6 to 12 month period, there would actually be a second license or second licensure exam. And that exam would also give the therapist at that point additional privileges, additional rights, but still not be completely unrestricted. What that license would do would enable the physical therapist to actually begin a residency, so that there would be assurance from the state, assurance from the profession that the physical therapist was now competent and ready to enter a clinical residency phase, where they would begin a residency in a chosen specialty area, and they would complete that residency in however many months it took. Most residencies are a year. And then at the completion of that residency, they take their board exams just as they do today for specialty certification. And it wouldn't be until you achieved that specialty certification that you got your complete unrestricted license to practice without any supervision or restrictions imposed. So it would be a 3-phase licensure process. It would require 2 NPTE exams and 1 specialty exam, and obviously it would require a huge amount of infrastructure. It would take, the task force certainly understands that this is big, and this is bold, and this is not something that would ever happen quickly. And we certainly have to have hundreds, if not thousands, more residency slots, certainly we need thousands more residency slots. I mean thousands of residency sites. And then we would need to build the infrastructure for that middle phase, the postgraduate clinical internship phase. So it's many, many years off, but as the task force sat down to begin to explore what we thought was the best for the profession, we didn't want to be hindered by what we thought was possible in the next year or 2 or 5. We really wanted to think way down the road for where we want to be as a doctoring profession. And it goes back to the comment you made earlier about we are doctors of physical therapy. We graduate with DPTs, and so many of us still want to go practice in a clinic that our work starts at 9 o'clock and ends at 5 o'clock, and that's the end of it. And they are punching a clock or have a 9 to 5 kind of job. So that's not actually the model that we would like to portray as a doctoring profession, and someone who is an entry point into the healthcare system and can manage neuromusculoskeletal conditions and movement system disorders. If that's the vision that we have, and it certainly is, then this seemed like one possible road to get us there. So, like I said, it's kind of a bold recommendation. It's not the first time this recommendation has been out there. Other people have come up with this idea before. There are actually some PT schools now that are experimenting with a model that's not too dissimilar from this. And these ideas, this kind of having stage licensure and a mandatory clinical residency, those ideas have been proposed before. So certainly, I like the part about mandatory residency. I don't think that we can be everything to everybody. I think that we as physical therapists do, like I said earlier, we already self-select a specialty area based on where we work. I think this just gives us an opportunity to further our training into that master or expert clinician that we really should be if we're going to be practicing at the doctorate level, and allows us to have this board certification in a way that our physician friends certainly will understand, and in a way that will help our patients ultimately, because it's not just about making our physician friends understand, but it's about making our patients better. So that we can provide the best care possible with the best knowledge available, with the best evidence available, and with the best training provided. Right. So that's really what the model is about in a nutshell. It's a lengthy report. It's available on the hub to all APTA members can access it right now.
Yeah, and I'll have links to the show notes for everyone listening to that report. Okay. So I fielded some listener questions. Kathy Cholik, we all know Kathy. She asked the question, she's curious to how that report will impact getting students and new grads to geriatrics and specialization. And that's a big theme on this podcast. I know it's something that you're passionate about as well, is getting people interested in geriatrics, but then also furthering their education. So how would you answer Kathy's question?
That's a great question. I'm going to start at the beginning. In my mind, getting people, students, i.e. applicants, interested in geriatric physical therapy is the first hurdle. And so that hurdle, I think, is really incumbent on physical therapy schools. I believe that with the aging population that we have facing us already today and growing, as we all know the statistics of how this population is growing and how they are underserved and how we don't have enough people that know how to manage these kinds of patients, and how the people who do manage them often don't have the necessary skills to manage them effectively and efficiently and promote the best outcome. So with that, and with academicians knowing that this is one of the largest populations that our graduates will treat, not only today, but certainly in the future, it's just going to grow. I wonder if there should be some sort of requirement for PT students to have some kind of exposure in a geriatric setting. That might be one thing. Those things are difficult to do. I understand the regulatory issues, the HIPAA issues, the compliance issues related to having students go into some settings, but certainly some exposure to geriatrics is possible. I also think that might be a question that could be asked during physical therapy interviews or as a part of the PT CASP application system, that to have them state if they have any interest in that. And perhaps physical therapy schools could begin selecting students who state they have interests in working with aging adults. I think all too often we admit students that are highly interested in working with athletes, working in orthopedic clinics, and are quick to say that, often because that's the only thing they know. And sometimes that's true. And sometimes I think if they had made an effort to have some exposure to working with aging adults, perhaps their answers might be different. But I do think that academic institutions have a responsibility to society, really, in preparing the future of the profession, in making sure that our students are interested in working with that population going forward. So that's number one, is admitting students who have an interest in it. Number two has to do with the model that's been proposed. And so to Kathy's question, really, once we have the student in the program, that professional education phase, as I mentioned earlier, would include integrated clinical experiences. And those experiences are meant to be varied so that students get exposure to every kind of physical therapy setting in some way throughout that professional phase. So every student would have some exposure to a geriatric setting. Now, in the model that we proposed, we didn't propose sending students all over the country to clinics, spread out in all over the country and all over the state or wherever. We were proposing to have a tightly controlled network of really partnering institutions that would provide this training, and that those individuals who were doing the clinical training would have a vested interest and knowledge of the curriculum that was being offered by whatever academic institution was their partner. And that interest might be that they are paid faculty in some way, so that they would really have an investment in making sure that the quality of clinical education happening during those integrated experiences was very high, so that when students do these rotations in geriatric facilities, they are not going to see mediocre work. They're not going to see substandard care, and they're going to see exactly what the academic institution hopes and wants them to see. So that's part of the other problem, I think, is that when we do send our students to some geriatric facilities, unfortunately, what they end up seeing are mediocre therapists, and they don't get jazzed about it. They don't have any interest in doing it because they haven't been energized by their CI. They haven't been energized by the facility or the setting. And part of that is because the model of our clinical education just perpetuates trying to find a clinical site, no matter how desperate we might be to find that clinical site. We're going to send our student there because they said yes. And that's unfortunate. And so the model is that we really try to provide a quality experience to the students so they get the right kind of exposure. And I bet you, some of them get jazzed about it. Yeah. So that's the professional phase. And then when they go into the internship phase, there again, I think there would be oversight, there would be time invested in working in these settings, not only as a learner, but as an employee. And so they have time to learn regulation. They have time to learn the ins and outs of the EMR and everything that's happening at that facility. So they become actually a trusted worker and an invested learner at the same time. And by doing that, a lot of the stress that happens during an 8-week clinical internship, which lasts about as long as it takes for you to learn how to use the EMR, it gives them an opportunity to get comfortable in the setting and not be stressed out by, oh my gosh, I forgot to put the G code, or whatever it is. So that's another opportunity, I think, for people to get comfortable working in those environments. Certainly not every student is going to go to an environment like that, but I suspect that many will, and there will be opportunity for us to increase the numbers in those kinds of settings if we develop really close partnerships with them. Yeah. And then hopefully at that point, those students who then have developed an interest in geriatrics, by that point, they would choose geriatrics as their specialty, and then they would enter geriatric residency for that last phase. So, yeah, I think there's a tremendous opportunity for the model to have an impact on geriatric specialization, improving student interest in geriatrics by virtue of the partnerships with the clinical sites mainly, backing way up to the point where we determine who it is we actually admit to PT schools, and should there be some sort of responsibility, I think, put on academic institutions to begin to look for people that have an interest in working with this population, since they are the largest users of our services in the country. Yeah.
So I think that that leads into the next question. So Joe Daniels, you know Joe.
Yep.
He's a freaking stud. I'm really excited to see what happens with him over the next few years. He's starting his residency this summer at Brooks. But he asks, what does geriatric PT need from its young and hungry professionals? So if you were to speak to someone like Joe, a new grad or even a student, or someone like me that's 5-6 years out of school, what geriatric PT as a whole, what does it need from people like us?
More people like you, for number one, but to keep it short, role models. So yeah, people like you, energy. So again, people like you and Joe, but I think setting an example in a clinic to where people like the two of you can energize not just your patients, but you're going to energize the entire clinic and get people interested. Really beginning to apply evidence and use that in the care of our patients, which we should have been doing all along, but all too often we don't see in some environments. And really being able to apply that and role model it and bring that energy to the clinics, I think that sets the bar really high. And as long as we have energetic people like that entering into geriatrics, I think we're in really good hands. But certainly we need more people who have that kind of energy. What you've been doing with social media, Joe as well, and many others, I think is tremendous. I think that is putting a spotlight on geriatrics that we've never had before. And so thank you for that. And I think that kind of involvement and energy is important. And that word involvement, I also think is hugely important. I can't emphasize enough the impact that my involvement in my professional association, the APTA certainly, but even at state levels in the states that I've lived in, has changed my life and changed my career in a way that I never would have known. And to stay involved as young clinicians and early professionals and become leaders in the profession, whether it be in your state or in your district or in your chapter or in your section or in your academy, whatever that is, that's, I think, the kind of energy that we need from younger clinicians.
Yeah. Mariana Wingate up in Vermont, she had a question as well. She said, if you work in a clinic that doesn't believe in evidence-based practice, or if they just don't do it, there's no presence of evidence-based practice. How do you demonstrate the importance of it, as well as how do you introduce or promote evidence-based practice? I would echo this question as well. Just several of the settings I've worked in, you mentioned kind of the clinicians that, are kind of doing the 9 to 5 and, they check in, they check out, especially in home health. I mean, you can do whatever you want as long as, you're write down something smart and have the patient sign for it. you can get away with a lot. So how do you demonstrate the importance of evidence-based practice? But I think more importantly, how do you promote that amongst your colleagues?
So there's several answers really for this question. The most basic answer is you have to role model it, and you have to show it, and you just have to do it yourself. And in clinics that I've been in, when that happened, other people start to look and ask, well, what are you doing? Or why are you doing it this way? And that gives you an opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with people, which I think is often much more meaningful than the lunchtime in-service, where everybody signs in and has lunch and may or may not listen all the time. But in-servicing and those kinds of things can be sometimes helpful. But I think the one-on-one interaction is generally a little bit better, starting with role modeling it yourself, and do it regardless of whether or not your colleagues are doing it, but hopefully their behavior will begin to change over time. So that's part of it. The other part is I think you really have to approach administration, management, DORs, rehab directors, rehab managers, PT managers, whoever it is, and get those individuals on board with understanding what this is and how important evidence-based practice is in today's value-based purchasing, healthcare reform, bundled world. And so, there's all those buzzwords about it, but it all just comes down to healthcare reform. Things are changing, and they always will change. But evidence and evidence-based practice is more important now than it ever has been in terms of reimbursement for our services or payment for our services. And so with that, I think if you can educate or have conversations with those in decision-making positions, that often can lead to systemic change. And by systemic change, I mean integration of evidence into the electronic medical record. Have templates in your EMR that mandate certain fields be required, and those fields can be tied to evidence. And those kinds of things happen at that level, but to have those conversations certainly are important. Home health presents its own sort of challenge because it is exactly what you said it was. And so in that situation, you have few opportunities to interact with people one-on-one, certainly not in a clinic environment. And so there, you do have to rely on your own ethic as well as meeting and having conversations with, I think, decision makers about incorporating evidence into clinical pathways or clinical protocols or clinical documentation or EMRs, whatever it might be. So that's one opportunity to try to get some change. And the other is you just have to have the right kind of people in place. And if you make every effort to do that, and you have role modeled it, and you have met with people one-on-one trying to mentor them or educate them or sort of show them the light, and you've done the meetings with your management team and those individuals are not responding, then leave. Go work in a place that is going to be a quality place, that is going to support evidence and not allow you to remain a mediocre therapist, or even in an environment where mediocrity is sort of tolerated or even supported.
That's a good point. Yeah, that makes me think of a conversation I had with Ken Miller. We were talking about just documentation systems, and how I've basically formed my practice around the documentation systems that I've worked with. So in the sense of I know when I'm doing a physical therapy evaluation, I have to fill in certain things before I can even submit the document. And many of those things are solid objective measures. And that has really shaped my kind of the flow of my evaluation, but has included more like, data driven evaluations that are going to, ultimately have a better that will better influence my plan of care, but then also be able to demonstrate the value.
Well, that's an important point, because when I say have your management team potentially put a field in your EMR that is a required field, I don't mean to say do a tug because the box is there. Right. I mean, you should be choosing tests and measures that are appropriate to your patient's diagnosis. You should be choosing tests and measures that are meaningful to the patient's plan of care. And you should be choosing tests and measures that will give you some indication of improvement, because you have knowledge of the meaningful clinical improvement change scores and what's necessary to make a difference in this person's life.
Yeah.
That's why.
Okay, I'm recording. So we were talking about picking the right objective measures based on the patient's presentation, not just requiring kind of blanket measures for every single patient.
Right. So choosing the right tool at the right time, setting goals using real data, meaning meaningful clinical improvement difference scores, knowing that it's valid and reliable in your patient, your population, and then using that information to drive your goals down the line. So yeah, when I say there can be systemic improvements to sort of facilitate evidence-based practice, I don't mean to say that it needs to be cookie cutter. And just because it's evidence and just because it's in your template, now you're suddenly doing evidence-based care. That's not at all what I'm saying.
That's a good point. There's a big difference there. Another thing that I think of too is just kind of what we're doing now, which, I know this isn't necessarily, evidence-based, but, Joe Daniels has come on board to kind of give clinical reviews. And I think of easy to use mediums that can disperse information quickly and effectively that people out in the field can consume in an easy manner. But I think of how can we do that in a way that actually changes behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that social media is really powerful, and it's one of the things that I think is going to change practice as we move forward. And the things like you're doing, podcasts, and even I think on tonight, the night we're recording this, I think there is a journal club happening online with the Academy of Geriatric PT, where all the SIGs are working together on a journal club tonight. That kind of stuff is exciting, and I think we're in an age now where people can engage in ways that are just, it changes all the time with a new platform of how we can engage with each other. There's great tools out there relative to evidence as well. I mean, I heard Dr. Lewis's podcast with you, and she talked about one of the online resources that sort of feeds you evidence every week in your topic area. There are others out there. Mendeley does a similar kind of thing. But there are great platforms that allow us to share evidence in ways that we haven't before. And I'm sure there will be new ones probably next week out there that will do that. So technology is our great tool, not just for evidence-based practice, but I think technology is going to be a great tool for patient care as we move forward with initiatives in telehealth and telerehab too. So,
yeah, that's a good point. So let's combine a couple questions here. So Troy Mead, he asked, what does geriatric rehab look like in the future healthcare landscape? And then Jonathan Walton said, what are Greg's thoughts on how he sees telehealth continuing to change geriatrics beyond just the daily vital signs monitoring that can be done in the home? So how would you just mentioned telehealth, but I'm curious to hear, just what your perspective, the general perspective of the future of geriatric PT, what does that look like? But then also, what's the impact of telehealth from your perspective?
Great questions. And actually, I think an easy one to combine. So the future in geriatric rehab, I think, is exceptionally bright if we in physical therapy can sort of do the things that you and I have been talking about relative to evidence-based care, and also relative to our own professional training and being prepared for the kind of environment, not just the healthcare environment, but the patient of the future. But geriatric rehab, I believe in the future, I hope in the future, is going to focus a whole lot more on preventing illness and managing chronic disease than it does now. So that I envision a day when physical therapy is very proactive in managing chronic disease and managing people who have multiple chronic conditions, rather than reactive in the sense of, you fell and you fractured your hip and you have congestive heart failure and vertigo and all these things going on. And so we react to that, which is how we do it now. But a proactive kind of involvement on the front end. I see physical therapists being involved in medical homes. I see them being involved in ACOs. I see them being involved on the front end to reduce total episodic cost. And so those kinds of things are opportunities for PT to work in a quote unquote primary care kind of environment, even though I wouldn't say that physical therapists are providing primary care, not in the sense that physicians do, but we're providing entry point to the healthcare system relative to the movement system. And so those kinds of things, doing things in a preventive way, seeing patients as physicians do, on an annual basis or a biannual basis, and monitoring them over time so that we can adjust physical activity regimens for them, and prevent chronic disease from becoming disability. That I see as a part of our future as well. Telehealth, I think, will play a big role in what all physical therapists do, not just geriatric PTs, but geriatric physical therapists, I think, have a really great opportunity to utilize telehealth services when it comes to increasing adherence to exercise programs, particularly if we're working on the preventative side. So where adherence to a physical activity program or an exercise program will make all the difference in terms of outcome. And by outcome, I mean outcome at the patient level, but also outcome at the societal and population health level, which ultimately, I think, bends the whole healthcare cost curve down. So it will be adherence to those programs that will make the difference. And telehealth will be, and already is in many instances, a huge tool in promoting or fostering adherence to physical activity guidelines. We'll be able to use telehealth, I think, to upgrade or downgrade home exercise programs when necessary. I think we'll be able to utilize it in some capacity for evaluations. There's so much is coming in the future related to wearable technology, related to accelerometers and gyroscopes on your phone that are going to be able to do all sorts of analyses from a distance that certainly we will not be able to do everything through telehealth, and that would never even be a possibility in physical therapy or probably even a goal, certainly. But it will become, I think, increasingly important in how we manage our patients. And so we have to look at this opportunity. We have to make sure physical therapy is in the forefront of legislation related to telehealth, and learning how to manage patients, again, preventatively to, and in the end, sort of decrease that whole cost curve. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to talk to Mike Eisenhart. It was the first time I ever heard him speak. I was very impressed. And he was the first person that I heard really talk about physical therapists really beginning to work with employers and not insurance companies to the point where we would manage the population relative to the employer. So, for example, you manage the health of all that company's employees and their covered lives or whoever is insured by their insurance. And physical therapists manage these patients before they're ill, and they keep them on the job, and they keep them healthy, and they keep them well. and they reduce sick days, and they make sure their kids are still in school, and they make sure, the whole family is healthy. And ultimately what that does is drive down the employer's total healthcare cost, but over time it begins to drive down their insurance premium. And so there's an opportunity there for physical therapists, as an example, where we're not reliant on a third party payer to pay us for services. And instead, we are working on a prevention side. So it was the first time I heard that was from Mike, and I was fascinated by it. But I know other people have talked about that too. But that's kind of where I think our future lies, is going to be in figuring out where physical therapist's role is relative to decreasing cost curve. And I believe that that's going to be front end management of chronic disease.
Yeah, Mike, he's an absolute visionary. If listeners have not heard of Mike Eisenhart before, there is an episode interview with him that I'll put a link in the show notes for. We were actually running while recording. I mean, the guy literally lives
cool. Yeah.
what he preaches. But I would highly encourage listeners to check out aphpt.org. That's kind of the group of people that are definitely trying to push kind of that health-facing mentality forward. It's the Academy of Prevention and Health Promotion Therapies, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. That's really good stuff.
I follow them on Twitter, and they're forever posting really, really cool stuff about population health and disease management.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, so there are a couple other questions, but I don't think we're gonna get to them. I was wondering, would you have any interest in me adding you to the Senior Rehab Project Facebook group, and you could address those questions if you'd want to?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to do it.
All right, I'll add you on there, and I'll just tag you in that post, and you can answer them if you want to. But I want to be respectful of your time. I want to ask one more question, and it's my favorite question. So let's say we're at CSM in Nowlands next year, and you have every geriatric rehab clinician in the room. You have their attention, for a minute or so. What would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that I believe geriatrics has a huge future in the profession of physical therapy. I think because of the aging population and the sheer numbers there, that geriatrics is about to be in the spotlight, or we have certainly an opportunity to be in the spotlight in our profession. And we can either seize it like true professionals and doctoring professionals and clinical specialists and experts and master clinicians who do the best possible care to improve patient and population health. Or we can sit back and let other professionals or even other physical therapists who maybe don't have the expertise we have in geriatrics take that and run with it. So I think we have to we have an opportunity here to really shine as geriatric physical therapists and come into our own, and also sort of come out of the nursing home shell that we have been in for decades, and move into a wellness and prevention and patient management kind of place. And so there's a big opportunity, and I think we can seize it, or if we don't, then I think that others will seize it, and geriatrics will remain an afterthought and a small area of board certification, which would be unfortunate, because I think it should be the biggest, of course, but in physical therapy, it's probably not going to be the biggest. Probably ortho will be, and rightly so, but geriatrics and should be right up there.
Yeah. And honestly, you mentioned, we have a great opportunity, and, just the countless hours, years that you've put in to your career and this profession, is a big reason why we even have an opportunity, to seize. So I just want to, thank you for I mean, just the years and years of service that you've, given to this profession in so many different roles. I mean, it's really impressive to see, just to see your bio. I mean, I had to cut half of it out to read for the intro because the whole episode would have been me reading about what you've done. But it's impressive, and just a sincere, thank you for what you do.
Thank you. And it really is my pleasure to talk with you, but also to do all that stuff. Because, at the end of the day, it's just words on a bio or whatever, but it's the contribution that really matters, and making a difference for the profession and for our patients. It's been fun. It's been a fun ride for sure.
Yeah, it seems like it. Well, there you have it, folks. Dr. Greg Hartley. I'll look at the links in the show notes. Everything will be in there that we mentioned in terms of the different reports, Carole Lewis's evidence-based service that she uses, aphpt.org. All that stuff will be in the show notes. I will have a link to Greg's Twitter profile as well. And then if you are in the Facebook group, say hello to him, or you can see where he answers some of those other questions we didn't have time to get to. So Greg, once again, thank you for your time, and I'll talk with you soon.
Thank you, Dustin.
Hit me. Thank you for listening to the Senior Rehab Podcast. If you enjoy this content, I highly encourage you to go to seniorrehabproject.com, where you can find more helpful episodes, lots of free resources, and to see how you can become a game changer and influence the direction of this movement. I appreciate you, and I'll talk with you soon. But in the meantime, do not forget to stay funky. This podcast is sponsored by Great Seminars and Books. Have you ever thought about how we can become leaders in geriatric care, or how we can break out of the silos of rehab to serve older adults to the best of our ability? Well, myself and Dr. Carole Lewis of Great Seminars and Books will be holding a free webinar titled Breaking Out of the Clinic: Strategies to Become Leaders in Geriatric Care. This webinar will take place on October 9th, 2017 at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. To get access to this webinar, just go to seniorrehabproject.com/great. This podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Geros Collective, a podcast network that's redefining old and equipping healthcare clinicians to better serve our aging population. Find out more at geroscollective.com.